shared aspirations above greed. Now, politicians go very hand in hand with greed at the moment. But do you think it's possible to escape greed? And if so, how?
I'm thinking. Most of our morality is very, very socially contextual and socially determined. And most of our views and what we think is right and decent and how we comport ourselves depends tremendously on the milieu in which we operate. And what that means is that societies are subject to multiple equilibria, we would say in economics. There are places that are rather ethical in behavior, and there are places that are almost bereft of ethics. And one of the main reasons is that in an ethical place, the ethics of others weighs on each individual to reinforce their own ethical feelings or guilt or sense of right and wrong or sense of purpose. And similarly, in a place that has, for whatever reason, lost the ethics, and there are lots of reasons for that: brutal governments, brutalized societies, societies that have destroyed civil society, that have terrorized populations, can lose the sinews of moral shared values over time. So I do think that it's possible to constrain greed. Greed is a possibility within all of us, but it's possible to cultivate some self-control, and it's possible to have norms of limiting greed. And the examples I always give in our world that I think are not wrong examples are the Scandinavian societies today, which are the fruits of course, of their long history, but also of their 100 years of social democracy, which I tremendously admire as a political ideology. And I think it's the most functional political ideology on the planet. In Sweden, greed is really kept under control. And I can give a very specific example of it based on the experience of a friend of mine who was the CEO of a major company, very respected businessman. And when he left, he took a mega severance payment of, I don't remember, $80 or $100 million. Not large by outrageous US standards, but greed by Swedish standards. He was shunned by Swedish society, actually. He had done nothing wrong. And he explained, well, that's how it's done. They said, that's not how it's done here. And he really was shamed for many, many years afterwards by this experience. And he gave back the money also. And so that's a society exercising decency, actually. Unimaginable in the United States. Once a year I go to a dinner. I drag my wife to it because she does not, I shouldn't say that because we'll never get the invitation again. But, okay. We go for sociological interest. Okay? Don't tell anybody. But it's a lot of the richest people in New York. And it's not our normal social circle, though it is part of my research agenda. And they always put me next to a crook. A man named John Paulson, who's one of the lead hedge fund. And if you're studying engineering at Harvard, you study at the Paulson School of Engineering now. Okay. He's a crook. The reason he's a crook is that in 2007 and 8, he conspired with a firm named Goldman something, conspired with Goldman to sell toxic assets to unknowing German investors, and especially the IKB Bank of Germany. Okay? And the idea was that he put together this toxic portfolio of mortgage-backed securities that he knew the mortgages were going to fail. He shorted it, in essence, through a little bit more complicated transaction. And he scored $1 billion in the transaction as IKB Bank lost $1 billion on the other side of the deal. Wow! To my mind, financial fraud. Well, the SEC opened an investigation, and they thought it was financial fraud too, but they didn't investigate Paulson, but they investigated Goldman something. And Goldman ended up paying a fine of, I think it was about $700 million. This is the Abacus case. And they never admitted wrong, but they made a settlement, a consent decree, and paid the fine. They never went after the guy that did it. He kept the $1 billion. Not only did he keep the $1 billion, he was considered a genius in New York. He was considered, the top of the industry. That is when the norms completely fail. They can't tell right from wrong on Wall Street right now. There have been so much abuse, so much cheating, and it's not just my saying so. There's actually, I don't have time to elaborate, but there's a whole literature, professional literature, of studying the social mores of Wall Street. It's a crooked place. But the social norms are to champion money-making, not to champion right, and not to diss wrong. And so greed is completely out of control. And that's a very serious problem. And so this is the sense, we all are susceptible to all sorts of bad behavior, especially if it's encouraged. We know from the Sembrano study and from many other studies that we'll do terrible things if it seems that it's socially sanctioned behavior. And so in this sense, greed's definitely part of our psyche if it is let loose. And to come back to my favorite philosopher, Aristotle, he emphasized you develop good behavior, good morals, what he called virtues, arete in Greek. You develop virtuous behavior by practice and by emulation and by education. And so, yes, greed can be resisted. It can't be eliminated, but it can be resisted, but it needs to be resisted at a social level, not just at an individual level.
Great. Let's go. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I'm Nazik. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan.
Yeah. Bishkek?
Bishkek, yes. I'm very happy to be here with you. And my question is about the question which is very important to our country. It's about the alignment of the international aid to with the priorities of the country, because as you know, I mean, Kyrgyzstan is very dependent from donors' aid. However, there is a kind of a misalignment, and sometimes it gives an impression that international agencies help to build the second floor of the house, while government is failing to build the ground floor. So how should we address this issue?
Good. Thanks very much. So how to, if there is going to be help for a country like Kyrgyzstan, how to make it useful and work right. And now I can combine the answer that I gave about aid to the answer that I gave about politics to the answer that I gave about having goals. My job at the UN is to advise the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So they have the virtue of having been universally adopted by all 193 UN member states. They also have the virtue of being good. They really do express in a pretty succinct way what it means to have a society that is prosperous, fair, and environmentally sustainable. So achieving these goals would be a good thing, worth fighting for. So my view is, let's orient our understanding, our work effort, our development aid to achieve those goals that we have set ourselves. And the goals are for the year 2030. So that is basically little more than a dozen years from now. That's enough time to get a lot of good things done. When you look at these goals, for example, SDG 3 says universal health coverage. So everybody should have access to basic functional health care. SDG 4, which I really think is important, is universal education, at least through the secondary school level, for every child in the world. Pretty basic. SDG 7 and 13 are about moving to a low-carbon economy, something we have to do if we're going to avoid climate disaster. So my view is set goals, study how to achieve them. I think it's a major task for all of us at universities. They're not simple. How can they be achieved? What kind of investments, what kind of technologies, what kind of public policies, what kind of strategies to achieve them? What kind of metrics and evaluation? This is good core work of public policy and engineering and science, which needs to help us understand what the right parameters are. And then development aid, which I very much believe in, should be oriented towards systematically supporting the achievement of these goals. If Kyrgyzstan achieves the Sustainable Development Goals, it will build the foundation as well as the second floor. And if the international agencies take that on, they will help Kyrgyzstan to do it. It's not easy to do this. It's what we call coherence of the international system. Getting different agencies, different politicians, different governments, different specialized organizations to all focus on a particular set of challenges. And of course, if I just listed the goals, they'd say, well, who the hell are you to tell us what to focus on? But the advantage that the UN has done it is that it's universal. All governments raised their hand and said yes that morning, September 25th, 2015. They really did. And so that gives a legitimacy that is good. And my recommendation to you is that the goals are good also. I wouldn't necessarily have stated every one in exactly the same way, but they came up with a good set of goals that if we achieve them, the world's going to be a lot better. And so we don't have to keep reinventing our own thing. We should now try to do what collectively we promised to do.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. I'm sure you're all...
Will you invite me back sometime?
Well, yeah, now you've accepted once, we can hopefully go through it. I'm sure you're all as inspired as I am by that. Will join me in thanking Jeffrey Sachs warmly for coming.